standards and security and joint public safety cooperation between the police, accommodation providers and the Home Office to ensure that laws and rules are enforced. Mr. Speaker,
UK asylum system reform, Cooper's controversial overhaul. Right. Before we dive into what might be the most contentious political story of the week, if you're not already subscribed to UK Connors, hit that subscribe button now because we're about to unpack a government decision that's got everyone from Epping to Edinburgh talking, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper has just dropped what she's calling a complete overhaul of Britain's asylum system, and frankly, it's causing more ripples than a stone thrown into Westminster's murky political waters. But here's the thing that'll make your blood run cold or boil, depending on where you stand. She's temporarily halting new applications for refugee family reunions. Yes, you heard that correctly. Families fleeing war, persecution, and unimaginable horrors will now face even longer separation from their loved ones. Now, Cooper's not exactly pulling punches here. She's standing in the dispatch box, telling Parliament that the current system is broken beyond repair, riddled with exploitation by criminal gangs, and frankly, completely out of control. But here's where it gets interesting and rather controversial. The government solution? Make it harder for refugees to bring their families to safety while promising to close every asylum hotel by 2029. It's bold, it's ruthless, and it's got the opposition absolutely livid. Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp wasted no time tearing into Cooper's proposals, arguing they are nowhere near sufficient. His position? Anyone entering the UK illegally, and note those deliberate quotation marks, shouldn't be allowed to bring family members at all. Period. Full stop. The Conservative stance remains as hardline as ever. Send them back to Rwanda or wherever they came from. It's the kind of political positioning that makes you wonder if they've learned anything from their electoral thrashing last year. But let's talk numbers, because they are absolutely staggering. Channel crossings are up 38% compared to last year. 38%. That's not a margin of error. That's a trend that's got Downing Street in crisis mode. Cooper conveniently avoided mentioning these figures in her statement, but Philp was more than happy to remind everyone that things are getting worse, not better, under Labour's watch. Here's where the politics gets deliciously messy. The SNP's Pete Wishart accused Cooper of handing Reform UK more ammunition every time she adopts their tough-on-immigration rhetoric. His advice? Say something nice about migrants for once. It's the kind of political theatre that would be amusing if it weren't dealing with human lives hanging in the balance. Cooper's response revealed the government's thinking in stark detail. She's arguing that the family reunion routes have been perverted from their original purpose, exploited by smuggling gangs who promise desperate people a pathway to bring their families to the UK. The system, she claims, has become a pull factor drawing people across dangerous channel waters. It's a calculated political argument that attempts to balance humanitarian concerns with border security, but it's walking a razor's edge. The European Convention on Human Rights is getting dragged into this mess as well. Cooper is suggesting that Article 8, the right to privacy and family life, might need reinterpreting for the modern world. Translation: the government wants more flexibility to separate families if it serves their immigration objectives. It's the kind of legal maneuvering that'll have human rights lawyers working overtime and civil liberties groups sharpening their knives. Make sure you're subscribed because this story is far from over, and the political fallout is just beginning. Labour's own backbenchers aren't exactly thrilled either. Graham Stringer pointed out the elephant in the room. Many migrants aren't fleeing war-torn countries. They are coming from France. Safe, democratic, prosperous France. It's an inconvenient truth that undermines a humanitarian narrative and exposes the economic motivations behind many channel crossings. The pull factors he mentioned, better benefits, easier integration, family networks, these aren't being addressed by Cooper's reforms. The Ukrainian situation adds another layer of complexity. When pressed about whether Ukrainian children would be affected by the family reunion ban, Cooper quickly clarified they have their own separate system that'll continue. It's politically astute but raises questions about creating hierarchies of refugees based on geopolitical convenience. Apparently, fleeing Putin's bombs gets you different treatment than fleeing Taliban persecution or Syrian barrel bombs. The asylum hotel controversy is reaching boiling point, particularly in places like Epping Forest where the Bell Hotel had become a flashpoint for community tensions. Conservative MP Neil Hudson described his constituency as being in distress with the situation becoming untenable. The hotel sits near a school, parents are calling constantly with concerns, and the community is fracturing along lines of sympathy and frustration. Cooper's promise to close all asylum hotels by 2029 sounds ambitious, until you realize that's still 4 years away. 4 years of continued community tensions and political exploitation. Here's what's really telling about Cooper's approach. She's trying to thread an impossible needle. She wants to appear tough on immigration to satisfy voters who've been seduced by reform's simplistic solutions, while maintaining some semblance of humanitarian obligation. The result is a policy that satisfies nobody completely but might just survive the political crossfire. The numbers Cooper did share paint a picture of a government desperately trying to demonstrate competence. They reduced the hotel bill by nearly £1 billion, conducted more enforcement raids, and removed 35,000 people who had no right to remain. It's impressive on paper, but when channel crossings are still surging, it feels like rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship. The new agreement with France allowing direct returns of small boat arrivals sounds promising until you dig into the details. It's a pilot scheme, applications only started recently, and Cooper admits they need to prove the concept before expanding it. In other words, it's another trial program that might work, maybe, eventually, if the French cooperate and the lawyers don't intervene. What particularly fascinating is watching Labour grapple with the political reality that being in opposition is vastly different from wielding power. Opposition allows for moral clarity and righteous indignation. Government requires compromise, pragmatism, and making choices that'll inevitably disappoint someone. Cooper's reforms represent Labour's collision with that harsh reality. The appeals system overhaul might be the most significant change buried in today's announcements. Cooper is creating an independent organization to handle asylum appeals, describing the current appeals process as the biggest obstacle to reform. It's a technocratic solution to a political problem, but it might actually work if they can speed up decision-making and reduce the backlog that's keeping people in limbo for years. But let's address the massive elephant trampling through Westminster, the human cost of these policies. Behind every statistic is a family separated by bureaucracy, a child waiting for their parent, a spouse hoping for reunion. Cooper's reforms might streamline the system, but they are also prolonging separations and creating new categories of suffering. It's the kind of moral complexity that makes governing infinitely harder than campaigning. The conservative criticism rings hollow given their own record of asylum system mismanagement, but they're not wrong about the fundamental challenge. If people believe arriving illegally still offers a pathway to family reunion, they'll keep coming. Cooper's temporary halt might disrupt that calculation, but it's also punishing legitimate refugees for the actions of people exploiting the system. What's emerging is a pattern of Labour trying to out-tough conservatives on immigration while maintaining just enough humanitarian rhetoric to keep their base satisfied. It's politically clever but morally questionable, and it's unclear whether this strategy can survive contact with either electoral reality or legal challenge. The SNP's accusation about empowering reform isn't entirely unfair. Every time mainstream parties adopt anti-immigration rhetoric, they normalize positions that were once considered extreme. Cooper's walking into that trap, potentially legitimizing arguments that could come back to haunt Labour electorally and morally. Independent MP Rachel Maskell's intervention about dehumanizing and stigmatizing language toward asylum seekers highlighted the toxic atmosphere surrounding this debate. When former Labour MPs are calling out their old party for inflammatory rhetoric, you know the political center is shifting dramatically rightward on immigration. The practical implications of these reforms will ripple through communities, legal practices, and refugee organization for years. Local councils already struggling with housing pressures will face new challenges. Legal firms specializing in immigration law will need to restructure their practices. Most importantly, thousands of families will remain separated indefinitely while politicians debate the finer points of policy implementation. Cooper's assertion that border security must be in government hands rather than criminal gangs sounds reasonable until you consider the government's track record. The same institutions that allowed the asylum system to become overwhelmed are now promising they can fix it with more powers and fewer humanitarian obligations. It's asking for considerable faith from a public that's increasingly skeptical of governmental competence. The timing of these announcements isn't coincidental. With Reform UK breathing down Labour's neck in working-class constituencies and Conservative leadership contenders trying to out-hawk each other on immigration, Cooper's reforms represent Labour's attempt to reclaim ownership of the border security narrative. Whether it works electorally remains to be seen, but the human cost is immediate and measurable. What we're witnessing is a continued mainstreaming of positions that would have been considered extreme just a decade ago. The idea that refugee family reunion is somehow a privilege rather than a right shows how far the political consensus has shifted. Cooper's reforms might be necessary politically, but they represent profound change in how Britain sees its humanitarian obligations. The French agreement might offer some hope for actually reducing channel crossings, but it's worth remembering that European cooperation on migration has been notoriously unreliable. France has their own domestic pressures around immigration, and expecting them to accept returnees indefinitely might prove optimistic at best, naive at worst. Cooper's promise to modernize the asylum system sounds impressive, but modernization in this context seems to mean making it faster to reject claims rather than faster to process legitimate ones. The Independent Appeals Organization might speed up decisions, but if those decisions are increasingly negative, we're just creating a more efficient rejection machine. The government's broader strategy appears to be deterrence through complexity and delay. Make the system sufficiently difficult to navigate that fewer people attempt it, while maintaining enough legal process to avoid European court intervention. It's bureaucratic warfare disguised as humanitarian policy, and the casualties are families who might have legitimate claims but lack the resources to navigate an increasingly hostile system. This entire episode reveals Labour's fundamental challenge on immigration. They can't afford to appear soft because reform is waiting to pounce, but they can't go full conservative without alienating their base. Cooper's reforms represent that impossible balancing act, satisfying nobody completely while attempting to minimize political damage. The real test won't be parliamentary reaction or media coverage. It'll be whether these measures actually reduce channel crossings while maintaining Britain's international obligations. If they succeed, Cooper looks prescient. If they fail, Labour faces electoral consequences and moral responsibility for prolonging human suffering without achieving security objectives. What's certain is that immigration will dominate British politics for years to come, and today's announcements represent just the latest attempt to square an impossible circle. The asylum system needed reform, but whether Cooper's approach represents progress or regression depends entirely on your perspective on Britain's role in the world and obligations to the displaced. The political ramifications extend far beyond immigration policy. This debate reveals deep fractures in British society about identity, belonging, and responsibility. Cooper's reforms might buy Labour temporary political breathing room, but they are also contributing to a discourse that increasingly sees refugees as problems to be managed rather than people to be protected. Subscribe to UK Connors because this story is evolving rapidly, and the next chapter promises to be even more explosive than today's revelations. We'll be tracking every development, every political maneuver, and every consequence of these monumental changes to how Britain handles asylum. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next in this unfolding political drama that's reshaping the very soul of British humanitarian policy.